Won't be a moment, Chairman.
Yeah, it's come up as it's on.
Yeah, it's just loading. Okay, Chairman, we're live.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, members. Welcome to this extraordinary meeting of the Licensing Committee. First item is to receive the minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of November and are published on the council website. Are those agreed?
Agreed.
Everybody could wave or what? Thank you. Thank you. That's agreed, Kimberly.
Thank you.
Any apologies for absence or substitutions, please?
We've received apologies from Councillor Anna James, and Councillor Jenny Else is here as substitute.
Okay, I think we're missing a couple of people, are we still?
We are, Chairman. We're missing Councillor Michaela Martin and our Vice Chairman.
Thank you. Has Councillor James come in?
No, Councillor Else is in.
Oh no, she's substituted. Yeah, we have got that.
Yeah.
Right. Well, perhaps keep your eye open in case the others are trying to get in with the IT. You never know.
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye on my emails, Chairman.
Thank you. And Councillor Gale, I see is here as an observer. Can I just say thank you for your membership of the committee, Maxine? But it was rather a short period, but due to changes in the membership of the council, then you've gone off of this committee, and then I welcome Councillor Isherwood as a full member of the committee. Was a substitute before. Are there any declarations of interest, please?
None received, Chairman.
Thank you. Can I just remind, because there's representations from parish councils in the agenda, that members, you're sitting as members of the Waverley Licensing Committee, and you should act as that and not as a representative of a parish council. That's quite important. Thank you. Any questions from members of the public or from members, please, Kimberly?
None received, Chairman.
Thank you. Item 6 is to receive any action taken by the Executive Director after consultation with the Chairman and Vice Chairman since the last meeting. Well, there hasn't been any.
None, thank you, Chairman.
Item 7 then is the street trading review, which is the reason for this meeting, which is set out in your agenda on pages 5 to 52. I think Richard first is asking for clarification. Ruth, can you give clarification, please, on page 40? I just saw something flash up from Richard saying, can you clarify? So I think you said earlier before the meeting to try and avoid that, but can you just clarify for Richard the problem?
There seems to be a confusion between two roads, Park Drive and Mead Road. Mead Road is nearer the centre of Cranley, and Park Drive is about 1.5 miles out of Cranley to the east.
Thank you. And listed in that list in the first, well, the second on the list on Cranley on page 40, it refers to Mead Park Drive. Is that wrong? It's just Park Drive, yes. It's not Mead.
Well, we don't know, because initially I think I saw a paper several weeks ago where it meant, because it was near the centre of the village, it was actually Mead Road. And today it's a mixture of both. So I'm not sure, and we need clarification because I don't know whether there's a map with the roads on it and where we're talking. Initially, I thought it was Mead Road, but now I see that Park Drive has been put in as well.
Thank you.
That's clarification from Richard, if you would do that, Richard. Thank you.
Richard, does that help? Because I think this is a carryover from the current prohibited streets. So
indeed, Chair, these are the lists that were in the existing street trading policy. So they've been there for the last 5 years, but I will go away and clarify them. Whether I can get clarification by the end of this meeting, I can't guarantee, I'm afraid. But this is the old list, so they have been there for some time. If I get an opportunity during the discussion, I will email Jeanette and see if she's got any answers for me. But this does, of course, go out for further consultation, so there's still an opportunity to correct it after this meeting if it is incorrect. Thank you, Chair.
If we could get it correct before it goes out, so we put that right. Anyway, Richard, I think now I'd ask you to introduce the item, please.
Thank you, Chair. The street trading policy has been in place, the current policy has been in place since 2015, and it's normally reviewed every 5 years. But with the event of COVID, we've had an increasing number of complaints about itinerant traders trading on streets which aren't included in the lists on this report, the old lists, and have been causing problems with the local communities. And certainly one of them has been a pizza van in a residential area that's generated a lot of interest and a lot of complaints. So we felt it was very timely to review the policy now and consider a way forward. The policy has been out to the first phase of informal consultation, as it's described, and that's consultation with all of our partner agencies, with the town and parish councils, etc. And the list of people that are being consulted is set out in paragraph 4.9 in the report. So that outlines the people that have been consulted already. That's informal consultation, and the feedback from that informal consultation is set out in the report as well. We set out a number of options as well in the report. One was to revise the approach so that we designate all streets in the borough except the prohibited streets on our current list as consent streets, and that would give us the ability to control street trading on all of the streets in the borough except the prohibited streets more effectively, because at the moment what we found is that we are pretty toothless in controlling street trading if it's not a designated street. So that was our preferred option. The other options were to leave the arrangements as they were, to make tweaks and changes and add some roads and take some roads out, or change some from prohibited streets to designated streets. The feedback is set out in the report. There was some feedback from Farnham Town Council about suggested changes, which we've accommodated in the proposed new policy, and those changes are set out in paragraph 417, and will help both in Farnham and Godalming, and I think also in Hazelmere, where there was a query about street trading or trading in a prohibited street or a consent street when there's a road closure. So we've accommodated all of those things in the revised proposals. As well as accommodating the feedback and proposing a way forward, which is still the preferred option of designating all streets consent streets except the prohibited streets. We also consulted on the fee structure, and the fee structure is set out in one of the annexes to the report. So the fee structures are set out in Annex G to the report, and we're proposing those go out as well. So the next stage is for this to go to public consultation. Now, the public consultation is a minimum of 28 days, but because Christmas is in the intervening period, it's felt that we should allow a bit longer than that for the next phase of consultation. So we're suggesting 6 weeks rather than 4 weeks, which would mean that if we publish the proposed notice next week, the closing date for any comments or objections will be the 27th of January. And we would then bring a report to you in week commencing the 22nd of February, recommending that you adopt the new policy and implement it, or bring back any feedback we've had from the public on any proposed changes. So that's where we are, Chair. It's a very lengthy process, quite complicated, and we're now at the phase of drafting a notice for public consultation. And appreciate any comments from members. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That's most helpful, and we have a good deal in the report to look at. Members, first I can see Councillor Else with a hand up.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a small point, but I just like clarification. In the informal consultation for 410, option B, no change, and other options considered on page 11.8.1, doing nothing is not an option. I just find that a little bit contradictory and wonder whether that's a mistake, or whether in the formal consultation, B in 4.10 will be removed. And it looks as if a decision has already been made on that particular point. That was all. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I can, Chair, clearly the options in 4.10 are the options available. The comment later on is the officer's opinion is that doing nothing is not an option. So that is an option you as members have, but we're saying from a professional point of view, we do not consider that an acceptable option.
Thank
so
you.
If we didn't give you that option, it would be, you could challenge us for saying, well, why do we have to change it? So we've set out the options you have as members on the committee, and our advice to you is that doing nothing is not an option that we would support. Perhaps it needs wording slightly differently.
Thank you. Yes, that's clear. Thank you. Other members, you can either use the hand system, and I'm sure Kimberly will tell me, or wave your hand in the air, and hopefully I can, because I think I can see everybody. Anyone else? Councillor Hyman.
So, Chairman, I was going to wait until everybody else had made their point. So, if anybody else wants to go ahead, because I have read through it, and there's a number of things I'd like to raise. So, if anybody else wants to go first, they're more than welcome.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll come back. Martin.
Thank you, Chairman. I had three questions really. The first one was, as I understand it, if there's no designation, that means effectively there's no control. Is
correct.
That correct?
That is correct.
The second question was that what is meant by road closure, because there's some discussion of road closures, and I'm assuming that isn't like for roadworks. So that's some clarification of what that means. And then the third question is, how does this interact with pavement licensing? Thank you.
Thank you. I think on Richard will confirm, but I think road closure means where you apply to the county council for the road to be formally closed, so you can hold a market or whatever.
Yeah. There's just to clarify, then, no designation does mean that we have no powers under street trading legislation to control what's going on, and we then have to fall back on whether there is a public nuisance or use other legislation, which has proven very difficult in the cases we've had since COVID began to demonstrate or prove a nuisance and that sort of thing. So having the ability to say this, you can't trade on this street without a consent makes it far more effective and more swiftly dealt with. In terms of road closures, there are two types. One is a road closure under Town Police Clauses Act 1847, which we administer, and that's used for one-off events. And as the chair said, the other is if the county council issue a road closure order for a bigger event or a longer event. In both of those cases, there's been some confusion that if it's a prohibited street and it's closed for an event, does that mean that people can't trade during the event, which is clearly nonsensical. So what we're saying is if a road is closed specifically for an event, then street trading is permitted, even if it's a prohibited street in those circumstances. And in terms of pavement licensing only applies to permission to put tables and chairs on the pavement. It doesn't actually permit street trading specifically. So the pavement licensing was introduced for us to administer instead of the county council, to make it easier for food businesses to get a license to put tables and chairs outside their premises during the COVID pandemic. So that is subtly different from street trading, which is putting a stall on the street and selling goods from that stall. So they are similar, but distinctly different approaches. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Richard. Martin, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I think so. Although I do wonder if an explanation needs to be put into the document, because some of the responses from the parish council suggested they didn't fully understand some of the subtleties.
Yeah, okay, that might be useful perhaps at the end, Richard, to put in a kind of an explanation of the difference, those differences, if it's not that clear. Yeah, I think, you know, if there's no control on the street, there's nothing to stop a line of vans stretching the whole street at the moment, and there's nothing we can do about it. Okay, any other members? I think I heard before we started that Maxine, because she's gone off the committee, wanted to say something, but she hasn't got her name in. But I can allow it, can't I, Kimberly, if I'm so minded? So, Councillor Gale, if you do want to say something briefly, although you didn't get in time, I will allow it.
That's very kind. Thank you, Councillor Knowles. The reason I wanted to speak was because in Milford is where we've had untold problems in the street Cherry Tree Road, which has actually been going on since August 2018. And Waverley have actually had no powers to do anything about it. The thing I'd like to say is in Milford alone, there are no public toilets. So street traders who are pitching up for 12 hours have no lavatory facilities, and neither do any of the people who are queuing up for half an hour to buy a pizza. And just to let members know, one of the biggest problems we've had is the gardens of the people in Cherry Tree Road have been used for toilet facilities by the people waiting, which is not particularly kind. They've also had to experience smells and inconvenience of parking in their driveways. So this would be really helpful, because the council would have some powers to do something. Even the police haven't had powers to move a certain person on, even though he was offered other alternative sites, which people would have much rather he'd gone to. So just to make you aware, that's probably the biggest issue we've had. So thank you very much for letting me speak, Councillor Knowles.
A pleasure, and thank you. I think it's quite important for the committee to hear that. I think it puts it into some perspective. Thank you very much. Councillor Keane.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I do agree with Councillor Darcy about the clarification of road closure. I think that's a very good idea. But I have to say, personally, I think to have these prohibited streets, I think it's a good idea, because, you know, in Hazelmere in the past, we've had awful problems with street traders, and we couldn't move them, and they caused a lot of problems. And I think to change it and to make it, you know, designated, prohibited and otherwise, I think it's a perfectly good idea. So I would support it wholly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a point of clarification, if I may. Richard did refer to itinerant traders. Could I ask for a clarification of what that actually means? How often does that mean somebody can, as an itinerant trader, go to a particular street And for how long can they stay? Because we have had an issue locally to me in Cradley where somebody trades as an itinerant trader who appears to go to a particular street, go away and then come back. So a clarification would be helpful. Thank you.
If I can, Chair, I think the
Please.
term itinerant trader, I don't think has a legal definition. It's just terminology. But clearly, any trading of any duration and frequency can cause a nuisance to local communities. So there is no time limit. There are no permitted periods during which people can trade without a consent from the council. If a street's designated a consent street, they have to have a consent to trade there, even if it's for 1 day a year. Likewise, if it's a prohibited street, nobody can trade there at all. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I've looked for a definition which says an itinerant trader is one who travels from home to different locations for the purpose of temporary purpose of trading as their place of work. So it would appear anyone who travels from home and then sets up on the street is an itinerant trader, according to the dictionary anyway. Other members, Councillor Davidson.
Thank you, Councillor Knowles. On the itinerant trading side, again, a bit of clarification. What's the case of people who go from door to door and sell?
I think they're a peddler and they need a licence from the police, but Richard will confirm
that.
Yeah,
if I can, Chair, we've had some of this recently. They are not classed as street traders. If they are going from door to door, there's different legislation and they require a peddler's certificate. The peddler's certificate has to be issued by the police authority in the area where they've lived for more than 28 days. But once they have a peddler's certificate, they can peddle over the whole country. There is no restriction on where they can go and peddle their wares, as so to speak. So once somebody's got a peddler's certificate, they can go knocking from door to door throughout the country, selling goods that they're carrying with them. They can have a small trolley with them to carry their stuff in, but they can't set up a stall in the street. They have to work from door to door to sell things. We've at the moment got a group colloquially known as the Nottingham Knockers who are going around the Waverley area selling goods, and we've had reports that they're selling goods at extortionate prices, and in 1 or 2 occasions have been quite aggressive in the way they've tried to sell at the door to people. We have informed the police and Trading Standards Department, who are the enforcing authorities for that peddler legislation, so they're aware of the issue and are addressing it. But door-to-door peddling is very different from street trading.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I do remember from my police days that we used to have to learn definitions, and a peddler is a person who goes from door to door on other men's houses for the purpose of selling goods. So that's exactly right. Who's next? Anybody else before I go back?
We've got Councillor Keane and Blishan.
Right, okay, I'll go to Councillor Keane. I'll come back first.
Thank you. It's a bit of an odd one, but in the past, and not due to COVID obviously, but in the past we do have street traders that come over from France. They sell onions and all sorts of things on their bicycle in the street. So how does this apply to that? I mean, it's a very strange one to ask, but it is quite relevant, I think, because we do get them from time to time. So how would this apply to them?
I'm assuming it won't be allowed from the 1st of January to come over from France and sell onions. But Bridget,
if they're selling from a bicycle and going along the street selling from a bicycle and possibly knocking on doors, they'd probably be classed as a peddler rather than a street trader. It's only when they set up station and remain in one place for a period of time that they become a street trader rather than a peddler.
So these people stay in the high street?
Well, if they stay in the high street, then they would fall within the street trading legislation. If they set up place, and I think the guidelines in the past have been if they remain in one spot for more than 20 minutes, then they're not classed as peddling. It's a bit unfortunate we're talking about bicycles because peddling can have different connotations, but there was guidance.
I haven't seen them for years, I must admit. We used to see them. But anyway, Councillor Bishon.
Thank you, Chair. 3 small points. Page 25, Appendix 3. Please remove the provision that no animal should be present on any stall or vehicle. Yes, I agree with that. But remember, guide dogs by law are allowed to be there, as are other helping dogs. So perhaps we should mention that.
Sorry, Chair, was that page 20?
Page 25.
Page 25.
Yes.
Can we just make a reference to guide dogs are exempt from that?
Assistance dogs.
Yes, guide dogs and assistance dogs. Assistance dogs, like we have a lady that has fits and the dog picks up before she has fits and makes her sits down. There are helping dogs as well. So there are quite a few. Providing
assistance dogs covers guide dogs and other sorts of dogs as well. So we'll
okay. Thank you.
Providing they've got the official tabard that they wear, whether it's a red one, a yellow one, or whatever, they will be allowed there.
Yes.
Second one, page 36, 441. An annual fee is payable for street trading, etc. Yes, I agree, but perhaps we should add at the end of that, town and parish councils are free. See 4.17 and 4.26.
Sorry, so in 4.441, it says an annual fee is payable.
Yes, but not by town councils and parish councils. So I understand we're asking them to be free.
Right, okay, I'll check that and amend that.
That's covered by 4.17 and 4.26, Richard.
Yeah, okay.
And last but not least, again, page 43, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs from the bottom. No animal should be present on any stall or vehicle. We need to add assistance dogs to that.
Page 43.
Which number's that again, please, Roger?
Page 43, Appendix 3. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the 5th paragraph up from the bottom. It says no animals shall be present on any side. But we'll add assistance dogs for that, please.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else then, before I go back to Councillor Hyman?
Councillor Reid and Councillor Ells.
Councillor Reid.
I don't think I had my hand up, Chair, actually.
Oh, okay. Councillor Ells.
Thank you. Can I ask a question about what does living thing mean? Because in part of this report it says it includes living things, and then there on page 41, street trading means the selling or exposing or offering for sale any article in a street with no living thing included, whereas earlier on living thing is included in the description for street trading. And I just wondered what that referred to. What kind of living thing could we allow to be sold on the street trading spectrum? And the other thing I wanted...
Sorry, carry on, Councillor Ells.
Thank you. Just one other point, and I've lost my pen. Yes, page 35. It says special event applications would typically, but not exclusively, include. Now, I know that leaves lots of opportunities, other opportunities, but I wonder whether we could see events celebrating local and national anniversaries.
Yes, we can amend that. Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Richard, what does this living thing refer to?
I'm just trying to think about that, because plants are living things, aren't they? Of course. So I need to look at that. I'll need to find the references you've quoted there. I don't know if you know the paragraph numbers at all, Councillor Els.
Yes, I do, if I might, Chairman. Page
Yes,
30,
please.
page 33, 1.4.
Okay. Get there.
Any article or living thing in the street, yeah. And then where does it contradict that, Councillor Els?
Was page 41.
Page 40.
Page 4.
Yeah, thank you, Maxine. Yeah.
Okay. Have we got that, Richard?
Page 40.
Yes, point number 4 on 41, page 41. No, the living thing thing isn't included.
Oh, right. Okay. So we need
Appendix
to
2.
we need to make sure it's consistent, don't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
But also, I would like to know what living thing we might possibly be talking about. I'd hate
Yes. I'll
to see puppies being sold on our streets.
well, no, we've certainly somewhere else said no animal.
Yeah, we've excluded animals, but living thing could mean, you know, some runner bean plants, I suppose, are a living thing. So,
Only if you're a vegan.
Or a goldfish in a jam jar, if you remember back years.
or live baked fish.
we will get clarification on that and make sure that it's quite clear when it goes out to consultation what that means. Councillor Davidson.
Thank you. What Councillor Ellis has triggered in my mind is what is the control, if any, on this selling on the street of financial or other non-article services? For example, if the AA put up a stall, or the RAC, or an insurance company, are they liable to any kind of control from us? And do they have to provide a license or buy a license?
Richard, there's a low ball question.
It's an interesting one because I'm aware of arguments in the past that they're not actually selling anything at the time they're on the street. And I know there was some legal arguments about this where I worked before about whether they were actually selling or just promoting at the time they're on the street. And it wasn't just insurance companies and the breakdown companies, but also people like the World Wildlife Fund and other charities who are having trestle tables in the street promoting their charity or promoting the activity and giving out leaflets and asking people to sign up to donate on a regular basis to the charities. And that is a very grey area. And I wouldn't profess to be able to explain it all today at this meeting, but it's something certainly I can look at with Gillian and give you some feedback onto how they fit into the controls.
Yes, I do wonder whether something does need to be put into the guidelines to cover their kind of activities and the fact that they are actually liable for purchasing a license.
I mean, I think it gets quite complicated, Richard, doesn't it? If they set the stall up on the pavement, they need a license to do that from the county council, don't they?
Well, they do. It's all very complicated, and as I say, I'm aware in the past of lots of work with our legal team on whether charities and the AA are actually selling anything at the point on the street. Certainly, if charities are just giving out leaflets, that's not counted as street trading. The big legal debate was if they get you to sign a form to say you'll donate £5 a month, is that actually a sale? If you sign the AA form for a breakdown cover, arguably that is a sale. So there's lots of grey areas like this around street trading, but having streets designated as consent streets gives us more ability to control activity on the street. That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
And in car parks, for example, those who are offering car washing services.
Well, in our car parks, our parking place order prohibits that sort of activity in our public car parks. So all the car parks Waverley operate, we would not allow people to provide car washing. We did give a permit for one in Farnham for a short period of time, but it didn't work and they pulled out. So unless we give specific permission, the parking place order controls any commercial activity in our car parks.
Thank you. Councillor Blisson.
Thank you. Can I come in a bit on that one? My scout group in Esher, which I had joined centuries ago, we run a Mayfair, and one of our sponsors is an estate agent. Now, they have a stand on the Mayfair, but they are not allowed to sell any houses. All they can do is people can come along and have a look at their books. They're not allowed to sign anything. They can go into the estate agent's office on Monday morning if they like, but all they can do is show them that, and that's all we're allowed to do on our licence. So all they're allowed to do is just give them people information. They're not allowed to sign anything or take any money. And that's been going on for years.
Where does that take place?
My scout group's in Esher, Thames Ditton actually. It's on Still Green, and we've been operating that way for many years, since 1964, I think actually.
Well, a matter for Elmbridge Borough Council.
I hope I haven't muddied the waters.
Thank you. Anybody else before we go back to Councillor Hyde?
Yes, yes,
Martin,
Chair.
I
was going to say we've got Councillor Darcy. Sorry, have you put your hand down, Gillian? Sorry. Councillor Darcy and Councillor Else.
Right, Councillor Darcy first.
Yeah, sorry. Just a couple of questions again. The first one was about knives. Are they whether they included as offensive weapons, because they're not on the list on page 43. And secondly, where do buskers come in? Because obviously they sometimes use amplified music, and there are several buskers that appear in, for example, Godalming High Street. I'm sure there are buskers in other high streets.
If I could deal with them the other way around, buskers are not classed as street traders. They were another bane in my life in my previous local authority, but they cannot be controlled by street trading legislation. We experimented with licensing schemes for buskers, and we ended up auditioning buskers before they got a license, and it proved to be an absolute nightmare. But unfortunately, they're not covered by street trading legislation. In terms of knives, obviously, it is a difficult one, because if somebody wanted to sell cutlery on a market stall, would it be appropriate to ban that? You then stray into carving knives and that sort of thing, and are they offensive weapons or are they kitchen implements? But obviously, we need to prevent the sale of hunting knives and that sort of thing, flip knives and all that sort of thing that aren't permitted to be sold. We need to perhaps pick up on that, but it's a difficult one to know where you draw the line. And then of course there are age limits on who can buy knives as well that have to be applied by trading standards. So I'm not sure we would actually ban the sale of any knife on a stall, but that's something we could do. But you would rule out a certain sector of the market trading then. But I haven't got a simple answer to that, I'm afraid.
Thank you. No, that is quite difficult, I think. Councillor Else.
Chairman, I just finding it a little bit fuzzy around the edges with regard to enforcement and standard consent conditions. Now, on enforcement, we've got 7 points.
Can you tell us where you are on the agenda, please?
Oh, sorry, page 37. Sorry.
Thank you.
4.7 is enforcement. We've got 7 points. And on page 41, we've got standard consent conditions. We've got 17 points. Now, to me, those two should be correlated rather than being separated. They're not even close. They're a couple of pages away from each other. And on point 19, I'm thinking that failure to comply with any conditions attached to the consent may result in the revocation of such consent. And I wonder whether it had been considered in any way that may should be will, because that actually leaves the door open. But maybe that's what the intention is. Maybe the door needs to be left open for people to break some of these conditions and not lose their license. That's not something for me to decide. I think that's something for officers, in officers' gift probably. Just one other thing, if I may, Chairman. In these strange times that we live in, we've seen some really strange things happening with the law and with enforcement of regulations, etc. I just wonder whether there should be reference, or whether it's been considered, if there should be reference to this street trading being subject to any national emergency regulations as appropriate. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The question of whether it's may or will is an absolute. And with the enforcement of all legislation, there has to be some discretion, because the breach of the conditions may be something minor or trivial, which wouldn't really warrant revoking the consent. Whereas if you use the word may, it gives the officer discretion to decide if the transgressions are serious enough, they can revoke it. But if they're only minor transgressions, they can give a warning and give the people an opportunity to put it right. So I think may is the appropriate word to use there. In terms of having two separate sections there, the appendix is the specific conditions that are applied to the consent. So just like any license or consent, you'll be issued with it, and those conditions are attached to it. 4.7 on page 37 is more a description of how enforcement will be carried out. So they are subtly different. 4.7 is about how we would approach enforcement. The appendix is the specific conditions which will apply to the consent when it's issued. So I think it's appropriate that they are different. One is a description of how we will operate. The other is the specific conditions applied to a stall holder.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's awesome. Just going back to the may, that won't leave us open to a load of challenges and oh well, it says you may, well you shouldn't. Would it be better to say will normally, and then give you an open door? I just don't want to see a load of appeals and, oh, this isn't fair because you only say may and I thought I'd get away with it or whatever.
I'd need to defer to Gillian on whether, off the top of my head, I'm not sure now whether people can appeal if we revoke their consent as a result of breach of conditions. I'm not sure that they have an appeal, but Gillian hopefully may be able to clarify that point. I would still prefer the word may there because it certainly gives the discretion,
yes.
Which is always important in all legislation applied by us or the police or any other enforcement agency.
Gillian's, I think, is urgently looking. I can see she's looking at something.
Chairman, if you would allow me just to come back quickly while she's looking.
Yes.
Can I have an answer, please, as to whether the emergency national regulations situation has been considered in any way, whether it's thought that it might be useful? Thank you.
I think, Chair, in that respect, when emergency legislation is introduced, that legislation specifies that it overrides any current legislation.
Yes.
So rather than put it in the current legislation or the current policy, it would be the national legislation would automatically have a section in it saying it overrides any existing legislation and that sort of thing. Yes. So if you try to put that sentence in every piece of legislation, every document, policy document we have, It'd be an enormous task. So when they bring in the coronavirus regulations, for instance, they will specify in that what national legislation and what local legislation it overrides. So that's the way it's been done so far, and that's the way I'd expect it to continue to be done.
Yes, that is my understanding, that national legislation has precedent over any local legislation. Gillian, have you found an answer?
I have. It confirms that where streets are designated as consent streets, the trading consent is required, and there's a slight difference between consents and street licenses, but the appeal process is slightly different. Where a consent has been granted and is revoked, there is no specific details to the criteria to be followed. That's set out in Schedule 4 of the legislation, and there's no statutory right of appeal, but there is a possibility of appeal to the High Court. So that's the position if it assists. And just to come back very briefly, if I may, on the will and will normally, I think the suggestion is that will would be appropriate, would not be appropriate, and my apologies, that again, as local authorities, we generally abide by a local authority enforcement concordat, and that there generally is discretion in relation to the steps that we're able to take. With regards to the issue on knives, again, there is legislation already in place preventing sales of knives to those under 18. And the issues about carrying knives in public may be a matter for the police. And as Richard said, people should be entitled to buy them and get them home if you like. In terms of the itinerant ice cream sales, that's traditionally relating to ice cream sales. And there is a local London Authorities Act of 1990, which does confirm that the Stop Me and Buy One and bicycle peddling, which we've also discussed, may apply. And generally, the suggestion is that those individuals are in a place for 15 minutes or less, not returning to the same street on the same day, just in case those additional points help. And then finally, there has been a question about paragraph 1 of Schedule 4, whether the definition is correct in the paperwork that you've seen. I think it's just simply that there's a summary that's been applied. Technically, the legal definition for street trading is selling or exposing or offering for sale of any articles, including a living thing, in a street. So I think it's just that it's a more fuller legal definition in one part of the document and not in another, but equally both mean the same thing. I don't know if that assists on the points that have been raised in the meeting so far.
Yes, I think it does. That's most helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Councillor Blisson.
Very small one. Knives. Could we say domestic type or domestic specification of knife to pin it down? So that merely means knives, forks and spoons instead of sheath knives, etc. That pins it right down. Domestic style knives or domestic specification knives.
Yes, yes, I understand what you're saying. Richard, could we pin that down, or? We
can look at that certainly and clarify the definition of knives there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Anybody else? I go to Councillor Hyman now then.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, it's amazing how people don't want to speak or say anything and then want to for ages, isn't it?
That's your fault. You asked them to.
Well, I am concerned because this is about legislation and we shouldn't be doing it on the hoof. People should be prepared and read the stuff in advance. But there you go. Chairman, 417 on page 8, if we can, for a start.
Page 8.
Page 8, paragraph 4.17, where it's reporting the comments of Farnham Town Council in respect of the road closure order. We've mentioned road closure orders already. But here it says if we go to the source documents for that, which is on page 22, under question 5, any other feedback, this is the document that's come from the Town Council, they say that it would no longer apply for the duration of the closure, which is sensible. We don't have for the duration of the closure at the end of the of what is put into 417, which is then reflected in the policy by referring to the top of page 39, because all this stuff's in here 3 or 4 times. Top of page 39 is where it's been put into Appendix 1 of the proposed policy. And again, in there, it doesn't say for the duration of the closure. And so there is an obvious question to ask, should we add the words for the duration of the closure? It would seem sensible to do so, but the first few words say, if a road is subject to a road closure order, that it might be considered as an implication, but it's not a very clear one, because it says it's no longer be deemed a consent or prohibited street. They only have to do a road closure order once, and it changes our policy and the legislation in respect of that street, which is obviously not what we would be wishing to imply, Chairman. So that's the first one. Should we cover that one first?
Yeah, we'll deal with that. Richard, is it sensible just to add for the duration of the closure?
I'm grateful for Councillor Hyman pointing that out, and yes, we certainly need to put those words in for the duration of the closure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Now, thank you, Richard. Recommendations for fees on page 9, 424 and 426 refer to this as being legislation. As now, we're calling it a policy. It says that actually what we're doing is pretty damn serious stuff, and we ought to be reading our documents in advance and stuff, because we are making legislation here. Now, two or three pages further on, which if we go to, it's actually page 14. You're very kindly, people will notice, very 1414, sorry. That tells us in Annex A that this is legislation. So it tells us what the streets trading legislation is. There's under paragraph 2 at the bottom of that bit of Schedule 4 of the Local Government Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1982 says that we can designate any streets as a prohibited street or a licensed street or a consent street. And Gillian has kindly mentioned the issue of a license being subtly different, but we don't know in what way it is subtly different. The office report doesn't explain why we're not being given the option of licensing rather than consenting and prohibition. And I thought before we make this legislation, if that is indeed what we're doing, we really ought to know why, at least why, we're not doing licensing. Councillor Blishan mentioned they had a license. I don't know whether he meant that in terms of legally and whether it was anything like what we're doing here. But I think we ought to know, did we not? Why would we, because it's an obvious question for anybody reading this, if we're going out to consultation, if everyone's going to turn around and say, why aren't you issuing licenses instead? We should at least have thought about it, I would have thought. We don't want to put everyone to the trouble of and perhaps explain. So can you cover that point, please?
Richard?
Yeah, I'd need to defer to Gillian on that, but obviously when this policy was made 5 years ago, the decision was made then to go to use consent streets and prohibited streets and not licensed streets. I wasn't around at the time, so I don't know the background to it on that occasion, but we are simply following the decision that was made previously in terms of the overall policy, in that it applies prohibited streets and consent streets rather than licensed streets. So that matter has previously been decided by the council. I'm not sure if Gillian is able at this point to explain what the difference is between a licensed street and a consent street.
Effectively, it may assist members, just to reiterate that, as members will be familiar from other licensing work, it is a discretionary policy that we're being asked to consider here and comment on. It's for the purposes of guiding us when processing matters as a council and applicants about the criteria that they should consider when deciding whether to grant licenses or consents, but each should be considered on its own merits. So it's against that background that we have in place. And the reference to the legislation is the legislation which permits the council to put in place arrangements. So obviously it's local arrangements and a policy that we're being asked to look at and consider, but it's the legislation which governs street trading, and it's the arrangements that you're looking at within this report and reviewing following the last review, which, as you've heard, was some years ago. In terms of prohibited streets, those are streets where you can see from the paperwork street trading is prohibited. A licensed street is where street trading is prohibited without a license, and there are consent streets where a consent is required. In terms of the distinction between the activities, there are certain restrictions on street licenses which can't be granted to persons under 17, and specific requirements regarding the content of licenses. In terms of streets designated as consent streets, again, this means that street trading consent is required from council in areas outside Greater London, the City of London. And the distinction, I think, in legal terms refers to being somewhat nebulous, but it can be the case that consents may cover less formal trading than street licenses. And unless the council specifically gives permission, a holder of a consent cannot trade from a stationary van, cart, barrow or other vehicle, or from a portable stall, and that's set out at para 7 of Schedule 4 of the legislation. So it may be that it goes and drills down even further to those types of vehicles and items rather than a stall as traditionally felt. I don't know if that assists Councillor Hyman at all.
Thank you. So Gillian, can just a consent gives us more control.
The licence would need to be applied for, wouldn't it? In the same way a consent would surely. We are a licensing and regulatory committee.
Yes, no, they don't. Once there's a consent, provided you've got the consent, then you don't need an additional licence. That's my understanding.
Well, yeah, it's one or the other, but the point is why? Because, but if a licence actually covers, well, we were talking about peddlers, whether they're peddling or on an electric bike and don't have to pedal, they're peddling.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. A peddler must have a licence from the police. We do not licence peddlers.
So the licence would come from the police, not us?
No, in terms of peddlers, my apologies.
Yes, sorry, Gillian.
My apologies. You're quite correct, and obviously very familiar with the peddler arrangements, but certainly that's set out in the Peddlers Act of 1871, so some quite archaic legislation, but effectively those are matters which are excluded from definition of street trading. So that would be trading by a peddler under a peddler certificate, which falls to the police, and there has been a case in Chichester District Court area, council area, forgive me, which was dealt with. There are some other exclusions, so trading by news vendors, for example, trading at petrol filling stations. So those are quite separate regimes, if that assists.
Thank you. Yeah. No, we just don't. We mustn't confuse peddling with this. It's not within our jurisdiction.
No, I'm just still slightly concerned that I really don't know why we don't license as opposed to consent, whether there's an advantage to having licenses, us being a licensing authority, and if we're making the law, we ought to know what we're doing there.
If I can, Chair,
Richard.
If I can, Chair, I think the simple answer is, from what Gillian has said and what I understand, a consent gives us more control over the activities than a license does. And I think it's as simple as that, that the consent has been chosen because it gives more effective control than a license. We could have a long debate about the background to that, but as I say, this has previously been decided 5 years ago by the committee and by the council that the consent was the appropriate way to go. And it does give us more control than a license.
Yes.
And I think there's a bit of semantics in all of this as well in terms of terminology, but a license or a consent is a granting of permission to trade in the street.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. On that same page, whilst we're on page 14, halfway up-ish, the third down of the trading by and on and bit, the trading on a street. So, but what it's saying, certain activities are specifically excluded from the definition of street trading, some of which are trading on a street, adjoining a shop, and as part of the business of the shop. Now, I appreciate the pizza van issue over in Milford, but in Farnham, just up the road from me, in Firgrove Ward, we had a problem with a kebab van which was being put outside a cafe that was the cafe was trading during the day, and the kebab van at night, and the smell right up against other properties which were residential above. Enormous problems with parking, where people were parking all over the road at what was effectively a fairly busy crossroads, and but the police getting involved but unable to do anything. Very difficult, and problems obviously as a matter of neighbourliness. And I'm wondering whether, would that sort of thing be considered part of the business of the shop? How would what we're putting in place here actually address the problem that we had there? Now, that problem went away with COVID-19, fortunately, and the business did manage to get another pitch, which is handy. But then a falafel van turned up for some weeks, and when that person realised how inconvenient what they were doing was and how iffy it was, they kindly moved themselves on. So this particular cafe, which is a very popular cafe and a lovely lady, but the fact that the way that things worked, the council was unable to place any control on. If somebody built I think we've got the thing. I think the thing will be, Richard, that there has to be part of that shop's business, not just
if I
linking on.
This is about a shop putting stalls or a table outside of its shop to sell the same goods as they sell in the shop, or the same materials as they sell in the shop. In the case you describe, I would say that was not part of the business of the shop. It was a distinctly separate business, the kebab van, and with the street trading the policy in place as recommended, we would be able to do something about it. There is an issue here about people who have forecourts, private forecourts outside their shops. And in a number of our streets, part of the frontage of a shop is actually private property, which the shop owns, and we have no control over that. We only have control over the highway and the pavement for street trading purposes. So if somebody's got a frontage that is privately owned, the street trading legislation doesn't cover that area.
But it must not stray 1 inch onto the public area.
And you'll see, Chair, in some areas there are either brass studs in the pavement to illustrate the differentiation between the private area and the public area, or some other form of demarcation which shows which is public highway and which is private property.
Thank you.
Well, that's going to be wonderful for then, because we've been led to believe that this would solve the problem, and it's obviously not going to. So it's going to be some well-happy people now. You can't just assume that, Councillor Hyman. There may be odd occasions when we can't solve the problem using this, but in the majority of cases, it will solve the problems we've experienced in the last 6 to 9 months. Right. So what about if someone is trading from their own property? Do we have any controls at all over that, or will it still? This only applies to on public property, does it? Well, I would have thought people needed to get a license from the Surrey County Council or us anyway.
If it's part of the street or the highway, if it's private frontage of a property, they don't have to get consent, and that's been the law for as long as I can remember.
Okay, so this
they're subject to environment. They're subject to environmental health, obviously.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Okay.
And it has to be part of the business of the shop, as it says there. So
it does have to be part of the business of the shop, even on their own land.
No, that's the difficult area, and we can't use this legislation to deal with that. So that's a debate I think we can have somewhere else, because that's not affected by this street trading legislation.
Okay, we won't want to be here.
Okay, can we move on?
Move on from that most disappointedly. Page 33, if I may, Chairman. 33. General guidelines that we've got here. When I went through that, I thought to myself, well, what about, there's an awful lot of people who don't have off-street parking, and they sell, private people, we sell our cars from time to time, change our motors, people come along and look at our cars on the street. Does this make it an offence, contrary to the miscellaneous provisions, whatever it is, law that we've just been looking at? Would that make it a criminal offence, or just contrary to policy, or whatever, if to everybody who flogs a car, motorbike, bush bike, whatever, unless they are on their own private property? How does that affect our council tenants, none of whom own any of the property around where they are? Can they never ever sell anything again anywhere, which might be considered a footpath or a road? Do they have to make sure they're on grass when they're doing it and park their car on some grass somewhere and flog the car? What about test drives? Are people allowed to test drive on the roads or not? I did also think of kids' honesty boxes where people are flogging eggs or knickknacks outside. It's very, it warms your heart to see the kids who put these little things up, and there's an honesty box there, or it's often selling odd things in seaside towns.
Okay, I think we've got the point, and Richard, I'm assuming that is not going to make it.
If I can, Chair, none of those activities Councillor Hyman has described will be covered by street trading legislation. There is other legislation controlling the sale of cars on the highway. I can't remember the name of the legislation off the top of my head, but it does restrict the number of cars a person is allowed to put up for sale on the highway. And that's a separate piece of legislation from this.
Okay,
so if somebody's causing a problem putting half a dozen cars for sale on the highway, there is other legislation to deal with that.
Oh, I thought we weren't in Waverley. We weren't allowed to even put a notice in a car saying it's for sale. I thought it was much stricter than that. Okay. On page 4, excuse me, section 4.2.1 on page 36, where it says that consents are normally issued for a set date or dates or a period of up to 1 year. And then applicants who wish to continue training should submit renewal applications at least 1 month prior to expiry. But we've got to give them we're going to have a consultation period, aren't we? If when people are asking for consent, it says renewals are normally allowed, but further consultations may be needed if the cause is for concern. And I think that could end up with someone not being able to trade quite unreasonably because we've decided we want to consult on it, because obviously 1 month in advance is not enough to fit in a consultation period. So my question I've written against that is, does this work? Presumably we're doing this already in some respects. We already have some consents that we are you're correct, Councillor Hyman. This is currently how it works, but there's nothing to stop them applying 3 months in advance, because it's at least 1 month. So
if I can, Chair, if an existing consent holder has caused issues, we will have been in contact with them prior to the 1 month before expiry to let them know they're causing problems, and we would advise them that because of the issues that have arisen, we want to further consult before renewing it, and advise them to apply before, in advance of 1 month before it expires. So it's about engaging with the traders, and if a street trader has been causing issues, we will have engaged with them before that 1 month before expiry. So they'll be aware and they'll be advised what they need to do in advance because of an extra consultation.
Thank you very much. Absolutely, that's very reasonable.
Are already happening.
But I mean, I'm not entirely sure whether we're making policy or legislation. If we are making what is effectively legislation here, I think we do need to be clear with people what the situation is, so that they can't complain about us afterwards. So you know, should we say something that sums up very simply what you said, or would Gillian say that actually it's not necessary? Because I would defer to her views on that, obviously.
This part of the policy is already working and working satisfactorily. So I don't think it's necessary, but I'll defer to Gillian.
Gillian?
I was actually going to come back on the other point raised by Councillor Hyman, just to assist on the vehicles. There's legislation which covers vehicles in London and then the rest of the UK, but it's the Clean Neighbourhoods and Environment Act 2005, Section 3, which has specific offences relating to vehicles for sale on the public highway, which is a separate criminal offence if that assists. And generally in licensing, we don't tend to duplicate other legislation. So just to clarify on that point. And again, in terms of the point that's just been raised, I appreciate that the provisions have been in place for some time, and this is a natural review after a period of 5 years. So it may be that the operational aspect is quite clear. And of course, it would be open for applicants to make inquiries as they would with any other licensing matters in advance if they have any queries or concerns. But the policy is certainly there to assist them in setting out how we operate, as well as for clarity and new applicants and existing holders of consents which would be in place, if that helps.
Thank you.
Now, my question simply really was, I mean, my concern when I read through this was, does this work? And I'm perfectly happy that you said it does. So, you know, yes, okay, I'm very happy with what you've said there. To some extent, you see, I still don't really understand whether this is legislation or policy as to how serious this is and how seriously we should take it. So, you know, that's really where a little bit of my confusion comes from. You have to, I apologise for that. Now, page 37, the next page, under 4.7 enforcement, which was touched on, but in a different respect. It does say here under C, in accordance with the enforcement policy, with a big E and a big P. And then under G, Council's enforcement policy. And I can't find an enforcement policy other than the paragraph I'm reading at the moment within the policy says enforcement. So presumably this is the enforcement policy, which confuses me, a bear of little brain. Can you tell me, can I please be told where the enforcement policy is? And that's it actually. I'm confused.
If I can, Chair, the council corporately has adopted an enforcement policy which sets out how the council will approach enforcement across the board. And certainly in environmental health, there is an enforcement policy which sets out how we will enforce, and it touches on things like transparency, proportionality, etc., etc. And I can provide members with a link to that document if they wish to read it.
Can we have it at the bottom of the page on the policy, please? Then in that case, that makes sense, doesn't it? So we can move on.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, it is. It should be on the website, so we can put a link to it.
Thank you. Yeah, move on, please, Councillor Hyman.
Thanks very much. And okay, now we're going through, but now page 39, and this is one which that's the appendix 1, the list of prohibited and consent streets in Waverley, and we've already had the comment in respect of Cranley, the question of whether Mead should be removed. At the beginning of the prohibited streets section, halfway down page 39, it says East Street in Farnham, East Street from the traffic lights of the junction with South Street to the end of Dogwood Way, including the area immediately fronting numbers 1 to 6 Woolmead, which don't exist. And we don't know.
It's been knocked down, hasn't it?
Yes. So,
right, okay, well, now, we need to deal with that. Okay, we'll note that. Okay. We need to deal with that.
Yeah. And obviously that is also referred to again when we come to the page 45, because we know that is duplicated on page 45.
We probably need, Richard, we probably need to use so many meters or feet or whatever to.
Well, also there's a possibility that that section of East Street is going to be entirely pedestrianised, so the situation may be completely different, but we've no idea when that development is going to be done within.
Well, yes, thank you. Well, we've noted that, and Richard will do something to correct.
Yeah,
make that.
Chair, even if it is pedestrianised, the street trading legislation would still apply because it's still.
Of course it will. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Now, what about? I mean, in terms of the list of prohibited streets that we've got here, we can see that most of these are sort of main roads, aren't they? Now, what if when we put this out to consultation, people come back with other main roads? If they look at the list they've got and think, oh, our main road should be on that list of prohibited streets, and we end up with everybody turning around and saying, for instance, in Farnham, Upper Hale Road, Recklesham Hill, the street, Recklesham, Firgrove Hill, Tilford Road, all of the main roads in and out of Farnham. We've got Guildford Road, we've got Hale Road.
Yeah, okay, we don't need a list of roads, thank you.
And I can go through all the other towns if you wish, Chairman. I'm sure the other
No.
do so.
If we go out,
what if you can understand what I'm saying? I think. What if? I mean, are we going to spend hours on the next?
Whatever comes back on the consultation, we will consider. People have the right to put in what they want us to consider, but we will look at it when that happens.
Yeah, and I think, Chair, that's what will happen. But I would go back to the report, which emphasises the need for a balance between the rights of businesses and the rights of the community. So,
yes,
in each of those occasions, we would consider the balance between are there historical issues in those roads that warrant prohibition rather than consents, or should it be just a consent street where we have control and can say no if it's likely to cause a problem? Some local authorities have just made everything a consent street and have got no prohibited streets at all, and use the consents and refusing consent where there are likely to be issues. So we have here the option of keeping the prohibited streets and making everything else a consent street. One of the other options would be to make everything a consent street and have no prohibited streets at all. But it's our recommendation that you keep these as prohibited streets so that we don't get lots of abortive applications for those roads.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's move. Just something which I picked up on. I don't know. Are we already requiring £5 million public liability insurance for any consent and anything that's being done? Page 41, that is, and it's at its conditions. This is Appendix 2, page 41. Sorry, Chairman.
Yeah.
These are the standard consent conditions which are to be used on all consents issued. Okay,
Yes.
'Cause I think there's been some confusion amongst members as to the pool of conditions and the and standard conditions. It says we need £5 million liability insurance and that sort of thing. So is that already in place, or is that a new requirement?
No, that's already in place, Chair.
Okay, happy with that.
And in fact, the county council often require £10 million public liability cover.
Yeah,
they're just greedy, aren't they? We know about them. 14 on page 42, the name and address of the operator and other address at which the stall or authorised vehicle is normally kept a garage must be conspicuously and legibly displayed upon it in a place where I didn't know that already. Does that already exist? And is that everybody going to have to start putting notices on their vehicles because of this? Does that already exist?
Yes, it does already exist. And
that's
certainly
the same for any trade, whether it be a shop or anything. The shops require it the same.
Right. Okay. Page 43. This is the pool of conditions, which has been referred to in terms of whether we should have knives and nunchucks and all the rest of it. Obviously, the point there is that it's permitting the sale of offensive weapons, and we do not want to start putting in a list of offensive weapons things that aren't offensive weapons. I think to answer Councillor Bishop's point, because it could get awfully complicated if we did that. In respect of these are not conditions which we automatically place, are they? In respect of no animals shall be present on any stall or vehicle, this is a pool of conditions from which we can put that condition on if we think it's appropriate, but we would not normally do so. Is that the case?
That's the case. These are additional conditions which we can apply at our discretion, depending on the nature of the stall.
Right. Okay. But it would be worth bearing in mind that if we were to put in place a condition in respect of animals, then we should pay heed to Councillor Bisham's point, which was very well made.
Yes, I noted that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Not particularly happy on page 44 and other places that the council's phone number just runs into being an 11-digit number. It's always difficult to read, but that's just typography or something you might call it. When we get to Annex G, page 47, I don't know whether people have read that, the actual amount of money that we're going to be charging people.
Yes.
And I think most normal people, when they look at what's their policy, oh, right, what are they doing with the costs? How much extra are they going to take us for? And then I think, well, crikey, are we really going to do that? We're going to increase from £143 to £428, which we know is an increase of £285, but it is about, I don't know, it's certainly a 200% rise, isn't it? Which is a bit more than inflation. Are we in danger of this being seen as a cash cow and getting complaints about that? Huge increases at traders' expenses. I would ask the question: how much are we making now? We've got the following 2 pages are a quite comprehensive and very good table of the costs that we incur in terms of officer time, just very simple calculations of officer or secretary time. It seems to be like 50 traders, it's 428, 51 traders, it's £441, and that's an increase from 160. Massive rises. How much do we expect to make from this? How much are we, well, what's our income at the moment? What do we expect our income to be in the future? What increased amount of staffing will be required? I can see it set out, but it doesn't tell me the answers to this sort of really what we would do, because Farnham is a craft town. I can quite imagine people wanting to be able to sell their wares on the streets, and it would be lovely if they could do so. But if we are just simply going to make it completely impossible, because 160 quid becomes 441 quid for some sort of event, it does make it might be doing the opposite to what we actually want to encourage in our enterprise economic policy, that sort of thing. So and what other charges?
Okay, I think we've got the point. Richard, can you come back on some of this, because I think we do all this make a loss, don't we?
No, Chairman, what other charges do traders pay is the question. So I want to see, we should be looking at this from the point of view of the people who are asking for these. If we are already taking a load of money because they want to hire a pitch on Gostry Meadow, and on top they're going to have a lot of extra money to pay, or is it not? You know what I mean? That's what I'm really looking at.
Richard,
the fees haven't been reviewed for 5 years. I never understood the logic of why having more than 50 traders was hardly any different from having less than 50 traders, and it's still only just a slight increase on the 50 to 51. It's not a huge increase in either cases. The fees are designed to cover our costs. The terminology, how much are you going to make out of this, is rather unfortunate. We're not looking to make money, and all licensing legislation is predicated on the fact you can't make a profit, but you have to cover all of your costs. And in the past, we've probably never looked closely enough at what it actually costs to deal with applications for licenses, because there's a lot of work goes on in the background that we probably didn't count. If we involve the legal team in it, that increases our costs significantly in terms of legal work. And if we have to make visits to sites to assess them with the applicant, that all adds to the cost. So these costs have been designed to ensure we cover the local authorities' costs in administering these license applications. And it's not a case of how much we will make. Certainly there will be additional work coming out of this, but at this moment it's very difficult to gauge how much extra work in terms of volume of applications we're going to get, and we'll have to suck it and see in reality. But what we do know, looking at this process very carefully, is that these are the indicative costs of dealing with each individual application. So the cost bases here, I think, are correct. It's how many of those you get will determine whether we need extra resources or not. And we're not in a position at the moment of employing extra staff on speculation about the volumes of applications we're likely to get. So it's very much.
Okay. I mean, and I think we have to also, I mean, for the 441, actually, if there's only 51 traders, it costs £8.64 a year. £8.64 per trader. So, and that will go down as it goes over. So it's hardly going to break the bank, but and we do have to cover our costs. I know licensing for many years has made a loss and is subsidised out of the general taxation. So, but they are large increases. I do accept that, Councillor Hyman, but.
There doesn't seem to be much difference, Chairman, between an annual consent and a single event. That seems to be very odd, for because it costs the same amount of money to, I suppose, to process them or something like that. But enforcement would be a completely different matter, and you would expect there to be completely different amounts of money involved. That's it's just that these don't really, to me, looking at them at face value, don't make sense, but maybe they do to officers. But I've got to flag that up because it's got to go out to consultation and see what people think.
They would see what people say. Thank you. Yeah. Can we move on?
Last point, if we just come back, if I may, to Farnham Town Council's comments, because I don't know whether they were slightly confused or not. Their actual comments are on page 21. We've got a load of pages of really weird, which I found incredibly unhelpful, actually. Was the summary pages, which are between page 15 and 20, where, because it isn't printed properly, the questions hang over the pages and you've just got loads of empty space the way that it's. I don't like the, apart from the first page, it just seems a very difficult way to read. We don't need both in future, I would have suggested. Farnham Town Council says on page 15, so this is second box down, second box in. Farnham Town Council does not support this approach. Need prohibited streets in sensitive areas by schools in residential areas. Farnham Town Council was emailed for more feedback, but there was no response. And now, if the Town Council has turned round and said they don't support this approach, although it appears to me that maybe they're slightly confused as to what the approach is, I don't know about that. Because obviously around schools they're going to be consent streets, so presumably there wouldn't be a problem. Nevertheless, should we not have made more effort to try and get before this meeting to find out why we are going entirely against what Farnham Town Council says? Chairman.
If I can, Chair, the confusion, I think, from memory with Farnham Town Council was over the question of prohibited streets and consent streets, in terms of they didn't quite follow what was meant by making every other street a consent street. And we did clarify to them that didn't mean we were stopping trading everywhere else. And certainly the other part of their confusion was about if a prohibited street was closed for an event, could they allow street trading? And we've clarified that in the draft policy. So I think, although it doesn't state in that table, we have addressed the concerns of Farnham Town Council in that. You've mentioned Gostry Meadow. Of course, Gostry Meadow is not part of the street. And if people are charging for the use of that, that will be Farnham Town Council, not Waverley Borough Council, I think you find. But certainly we did, I know for a fact, go back to Farnham Town Council and explain what the proposal really meant. And my understanding was they were happy with that.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Hyman. Any other members before we draw the meeting to a conclusion?
Yes, we have Gillian's hand up, but I'm not sure if that's an old one. And then we have Councillor Darcy.
Thank you. Gillian.
I can just very briefly come back on the clarification at an earlier point. It's something I missed earlier, my apologies. But just the query about the pavement licensing and how that meshes with the street trading. And you'll be familiar that that comes from the business and planning legislation, which was passed in the summer of this year and applies currently, I think, to the end of September. But there are possibilities that that may be extended. And as Richard Homewood has mentioned, obviously that facilitates the placement of items on the street. And he sort of very fully set out the provisions in relation to road closures under the two streams there, if that assists. But I think normally normally pavement licensing would fall to county under the provisions of 7A of the Highways Act. And of course, this policy is being looked at longer than the issues per se connected to COVID and the current temporary situation. Obviously, other temporary legislation has been put in place to assist, and that may also help with the point that's made by Councillor Else about whether it's necessary to have additional provisions relating to national restrictions. But I think dealing with the current situation where appropriate, as Richard has also mentioned, legislation has been put in place to address specific concerns, and generally in normal times of licensing we don't seek to duplicate other legislative provisions, in case that assists members. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Darcy.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Hyman raised something which I found quite interesting, which was the difference between standard conditions and other conditions, and when those other conditions might be applied, because they look like some of them you would want to apply them all the time. But for example, the offensive weapons, I can't imagine we'd want to have a stall selling offensive weapons, but I don't know, maybe we do. So that's the question: when would those ones be applied, and how would we know that that's happened?
If I can, Chair, obviously we would apply those conditions where appropriate. If a stall was proposing to sell plants, garden plants and nursery plants, you wouldn't expect to apply a condition to that to prohibit the sale of offensive weapons. But if somebody had a stall selling housewares, you would more than likely apply that condition about offensive weapons, because they're likely to be selling the cutlery and knives to go with the plates, bowls and everything else they're selling on that stall. So it would be almost nonsensical to apply conditions to a stall that's got no logical reason to start selling offensive weapons by the very nature of their trade. But you could put them all on every consent, but then that may look a bit like overkill in some circumstances.
If I may also just add that the policy obviously provides guidance and criteria, but each application should be dealt with very much on its merits by the council. And I think the provisions do allow for specific details to be set out in the consents given, including days, times, goods sold, the place in the street, size and timings, etc. So it may be that that's, as Richard Homewood has confirmed, set out and would be dealt with on a case-by-case basis if that assists.
Thank you. Councillor Keane.
Thank you, Chair. Just a comment on the fees and the proposed fees. To a degree, I can understand where Councillor Hyman's coming from, because anybody looking at these fees would be quite shocked, I would think. But it's just unfortunate that there wasn't an annual rise instead of this rise after 5 years. But I'm just asking Richard, is it worth putting somewhere on this summary draft of fees that, you know, there hasn't been a rise in 5 odd years, so that people understand why this rise is necessary? I mean, I don't know. I see Mr. Hyman shaking his head, but I just wondered if it might be appropriate. Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, thank you.
We can look at that, Chair, certainly.
Okay.
Chairman, may I just say that I think it would be inappropriate to say that it's due to inflation when everybody knows there's only been 2% inflation per annum for the past few years. It would be far better to say that this is because we've actually costed it, because otherwise people will think we're nutters to put up 200% rises pretending it's inflation. We'll just be laughed at. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else, please? Kimberly, anybody, any hands up?
Councillor Blishen has his hand up.
Councillor Bishop.
One small point, we were talking about knives, etc. Then something occurred to me. We're talking about selling plants. Garden tools can be absolutely wicked. I mean, my folding pruning knife, I wouldn't wish that on any youngster because it's a really dangerous weapon. So perhaps we should add that to it. I know it's a small point, but you do see what where I'm getting at.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Richard. Okay, everybody. I think that we've aired this very well indeed. So the recommendation is that we note the feedback, which I'm sure we have done at some length, and the draft notice for publication. So can we agree that subject to the amendments we've made, we've added words and we've corrected streets, subject to all the amendments that we have agreed, that this should go out to consultation?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you. Anyone against? No, that is agreed. Then we will go out to consultation. Thank you, members. That brings to an end this meeting. Thank you for your attendance. Order.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a very Merry Christmas, Chairman.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. It's not Christmas yet. No.
It's coming up. It's coming up, Jerry.
Where's my mince pies?